The Abyssal Forge. The outer rim was not empty. It was aggressively dark. It was a suffocating, starless stretch of the cosmos, where the laws of the core worlds went to die. Aboard the bridge of the stolen Directorate transport, now hastily rechristened the Jarek's Toll, Sabine stared at the tactical hololith. It didn't display enemy fleets or territorial borders. It displayed a terrifying slow-motion logistical collapse. Behind them trailed the Exodus fleet. It was a miserable, chained-together procession of 12 heavy foundry barges. They were built to haul raw ore from low orbit, not to carry 300,000 terrified citizens across deep space. Vessel-class population system integrity. Directorate transport, Jarek's Toll. 45 bridge crew, nominal. Stealth drives active. Heavy foundry barges, times 12, approximately 25,000 per vessel. Critical. 110% over mass capacity. Salvaged escort skiffs, times 4. 12 pilots/gunners, running on recycled coolant. Barge 7 is bleeding Atmo again, Captain, a young comms officer reported. He was wearing an oversized, scorch-marked Directorate jacket over his miner's overalls. Their secondary scrubbers choked on the ash from the launch. If we don't bleed our own reserves to flush their system, they'll suffocate in 6 hours. Sabine rubbed her eyes. The adrenaline of Oros had faded, leaving behind a cold, crushing exhaustion. Route auxiliary lines from our port tanks. Give them a 20% flush. It buys them a day. It costs us too, the officer murmured, though he complied, his fingers flying across the cracked glass of the console. In the corner of the bridge, Lyra sat cross-legged on the cold deck plates. The silver transformation had stabilized into a dull, leaden patina. She no longer glowed with the blinding light of the Matrix, but she was fundamentally changed. She was running a piece of scrap iron, the slag cutter handle left by Jarek, over her knuckles, the metal moving with unnatural, frictionless fluidity. "We cannot stop to patch the lung ships," Lyra said. Her voice was quiet, lacking the dual harmonic boom of the spire, but it carried a terrifying certainty. The Directorate hunters are blind, but they are not deaf. If we cut the engines to run external repairs, our thermal bloom will pool in the vacuum. They will smell the heat. "If we don't stop, the people on Barge 7 die in the dark, Lyra," Sabine snapped, the tension finally cracking her voice. "Iron does not rust in the dark, Sabine. It only rusts when it breathes," Lyra replied, looking up with mercury pool eyes. "We need a forge, a place to cast the slag into a shield. There is an anomaly on the deep-range auspex, a shadow that is colder than the void around it." Sabine leaned over the console, bringing up the long-range passive sensors. Lyra was right. 3 light cycles ahead, there was a massive, jagged void in the ambient radiation of the sector. It wasn't a planet, it was a structure, something immense, dead, and entirely off the old Empire's star charts. "Adjust vector," Sabine ordered, her hand resting on the hololith. "Take us into the shadow." As the Jarek's Toll and its desperate, suffocating train of barges pushed into the sensor shadow, the ambient starlight of the outer rim simply vanished. They hadn't flown into a nebula. They had flown into the gravitational wake of a corpse. "It's not a ship, Captain," the comms officer whispered, staring at the telemetry readouts with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "It's a tectonic body. But there's no rock, no crust. It's all metal." Floating in the absolute zero of the deep void was a rogue megastructure the size of a small moon. It was an abyssal globe of interlocking black iron plates, each continent-sized slab covered in a brutal, Gothic topography of silent cooling towers, trench-like exhaust vents, and massive planetary-scale docking clamps. It was entirely dark, lacking a single running light, perfectly camouflaged against the black canvas of the universe. An abyssal forge, Lyra said, her silver-gray eyes reflecting the faint console lights. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded like she was greeting an old, dangerous friend. Before the old empire built the Ethel cradle to weave their mines, they needed a place to weave their armor. This is where the first unification fleets were born, and where they were buried when the Directorate decided it was too powerful to leave turned on. Sabine stared at the monolithic structure. It was terrifying, but it was massive enough to hide 300,000 refugees. Can we crack the shell? Get the barges inside before their scrubbers choke out completely? The primary planetary maw is dead, Lyra replied, her metallic fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air, feeling the dormant magnetic fields of the ancient construct. But I can force a maintenance iris open. It will be tight. We will have to drag the barges in by their tow cables. The descent into the maw. Sabine piloted the Jarek's toll through a colossal, jagged trench that cut miles deep into the forge's outer mantle. As they slipped through a heavily corroded manual iris, the Exodus fleet entered the hollowed-out interior of the world. Inside, it was a cavernous, zero-gravity cathedral of dead industry. Millions of frozen, skeletal scaffolding arms hung over empty dry docks large enough to hold continent-sized dreadnoughts. But Sabine's eyes were drawn to the center of the hollow world. Suspended in the exact gravitational dead center was the technology Lyra had brought them to find. "What in the void is that?" Sabine breathed. It was a void loom, a spherical gyroscopic engine the size of a mountain, surrounded by rings of frozen, crystalline machinery. The Directorate relies on supply chains and chemical farming, Lyra explained, stepping closer to the viewport. The architects of the Abyssal Forge didn't have time for that. The void loom is a localized subatomic foundry. You feed it raw, dead matter, comets, scrap iron, irradiated dust, and it breaks it down to the molecular level. Lyra placed her lead-colored hand against the glass. It doesn't just forge hull plating, Sabine. It weaves oxygen molecules. It synthesizes potable water. It formats raw carbon into edible protein paste. If we can spark the loom, we don't just patch the barges. We can sustain the entire fleet indefinitely. "Nothing that powerful comes for free," Sabine said, her cynical survival instincts kicking in. "If it's a miracle machine, why did the Directorate abandon it? Why not take it back to the core worlds?" "Because of what it uses for a spark," Lyra said, her voice dropping to a grim monotone. "The loom requires an organic neuromatrix to regulate the molecular weaving. It requires a conductor, and the machine does not let its conductors leave." Sabine's stomach dropped. She looked down into the lower orbital tiers of the cavernous forge, where thousands of ancient, rust-fused life support pods hung like dead fruit from the scaffolding. Inside each pod was the mummified, cybernetically fused husk of an ancient Scrap-Born. The original pilots who had been wired into the loom centuries ago, their minds burned out to fuel the Empire's war machine. The anomaly offered salvation for the 300,000 suffocating citizens in the barges, but the cost was horrific. The Abyssal Forge didn't just run on scrap, it ran on sacrifice. "We have hours before Barge 7 asphyxiates," Sabine said, grabbing her scattergun and checking the action. The heavy clack of the iron chamber echoed loudly on the quiet bridge. "Get a boarding party of volunteers. We're going down to the loom. We're going to wake this monster up, and we're going to find a way to do it without feeding it one of our own." "Captain," the comms crackled, the voice on the other end sounding like it was speaking through wet ash. "This is Barge 7. The secondary scrubbers just seized. We are breathing our own exhaust. The elderly are already passing out." Sabine tightened the seals on her deep void EVA suit. She stood in the primary airlock of the Jarek's Toll, holding a heavy magnetic grapple gun. Behind her stood 6 foundry miners, their bulky industrial hazard suits patched with blast tape. "Hold the line, Seven," Sabine ordered, her voice projecting a calm she didn't feel. "We are at the loom's threshold. Keep everyone low to the deck plates where the oxygen is pooling. We're going to turn the air back on." She cut the channel. There was no time for reassurance. Sabine hit the manual release, and the airlock blew open into the cavernous, zero-gravity belly of the Abyssal. They fired their grapples, the magnetic pythons striking the frozen, black-iron hull of the void loom. Using the winches, the boarding party pulled themselves through the empty expanse, floating past the thousands of mummified conductors hanging in their glass and iron sarcophagi. Up close, the loom was a terrifying marriage of industrial machinery and grim biology. The control interface wasn't a bridge, it was an altar. At the dead center of the gyroscopic rings sat the conductor's cradle, a massive iron-wrought throne lined with hundreds of neural bore needles designed to interface directly with the human spine and skull. The needles were stained with centuries-old dried black fluid. "We can't bypass it," one of the miners, a heavy-set rigger named Corso, grunted as he pried open the primary console with a crowbar. "The whole ignition sequence is hardwired into the cradle. It needs a central nervous system to act as a logic gate, or the subatomic weavers will tear themselves apart." Sabine stared at the iron throne. "There has to be a manual override, a battery we can bridge, something." "There is no battery, Sabine." Lyra drifted into the chamber, using a pair of salvaged maneuvering thrusters. In the vacuum of the forge, her lead-colored skin absorbed the weak light from the miners' headlamps. She floated directly toward the cradle. "Lyra." "No," Sabine said, stepping between the girl and the iron throne. "We are not leaving you in this nightmare. We just pulled you out of the fire on Oros." "I am not human anymore, Sabine," Lyra said quietly, her silver eyes locking onto the needles. "The matrix fluid changed my physiology. My nervous system is already a closed logic loop. The machine was designed to consume flesh because flesh burns out. But I am iron now." Before Sabine could stop her, Lyra drifted past and settled into the cradle. As soon as her back touched the iron, the loom reacted. It didn't wait for a manual prompt. The ancient sensors detected the matrix fluid in Lyra's veins. With a sickening metallic shunk, the neural bore needles slammed forward, driving directly into the base of Lyra's neck and down her spine. Lyra's back arched violently. Her mouth opened in a silent, vacuum-muffled scream as the dead machine suddenly drank from her endless, quicksilver consciousness. Instantly, the Abyssal Forge woke up. Deep within the cavernous world, massive fusion boilers ignited with a deep, vibrating rumble that shook the deck plates. The mountain-sized gyroscopic rings of the void loom began to spin, shedding centuries of frost. In the barges above, emergency vents blasted open, flooding the suffocating holds with pure, synthesized oxygen woven from the dead comets outside the shell. "She did it," Corso shouted over the comms, watching the telemetry screens light up green. "Captain, the loom is weaving. Barge 7 is breathing." But Sabine wasn't looking at the screens. She was looking at Lyra. The girl was convulsing in the cradle. Her eyes had rolled back, glowing with an intense, sickly amber light. And then, all around them, the thousands of dead conductor pods suspended in the dark began to light up. "Sabine," Lyra's voice came through the comms, but it wasn't just her voice. It was layered, echoing with the digital screams of thousands of ancient, trapped minds. "Sabine, the machine didn't just consume them, it kept them. Their minds are still in the lattice. They are angry, and they want out." The ancient, mummified Scrap-Born in the glass pods above began to twitch. The dead were riding the power surge Lyra had just provided. The forge was alive, but so were its ghosts. The sound of 1,000 glass sarcophagi shattering in a vacuum doesn't echo in the air. It rattles through the deck plates and into the soles of your boots. Above the void loom, the canopy of ancient life support pods was bursting open. The mummified Scrap-Born, centuries dead, their flesh petrified into black leather over rusted iron armatures, were pulling themselves out. Their optical sensors flickered to life, burning with the same angry amber corruption that was currently bleeding into Lyra's eyes. "They're using her!" Corso yelled over the comms, frantically pointing at the diagnostic hololith. The Gestalt consciousness is trapped in the loom's secondary drives. They're trying to download themselves into Lyra's matrix to escape, using the physical umbilicals, connecting the pods to the core. "If they overwrite her, does the loom stop?" Sabine asked, raising her scattergun as the first wave of husks began to crawl down the frozen scaffolding like metallic spiders. "Worse," Corso grunted, his fingers flying across the console. "If they take the cradle, they take the targeting systems. They won't just stop weaving oxygen. They'll turn the loom's raw atomic beams on the barges and break the fleet down into spare carbon." Sabine checked the oxygen telemetry. Barge 7, 40% saturation. They needed more time. They couldn't unplug Lyra, but they couldn't let the dead reach her. "We cut the bridge," Sabine ordered, her voice cold and absolute. "Corso, where are the data trunks connecting the pod canopy to the cradle?" "3 main neural umbilicals," Corso said, highlighting 3 massive armored cables the size of tree trunks that anchored the loom to the ceiling of the forge. "But they are shielded with heavy durasteel. You can't just shoot them." "I don't need to shoot them," Sabine said. She holstered her scattergun and unclipped the heavy, industrial slag cutter from her belt. "I'm going to melt them. Miners, defensive perimeter around the cradle. Do not let those things touch the girl." Sabine fired her magnetic grapple, launching herself upward toward the first, massive umbilical cord. Behind her, the void erupted in silent violence. The miners braced their heavy boots against the loom's iron chassis, firing rivets and mining charges into the descending swarm. In zero gravity, the recoil of their heavy tools pushed them backward, forcing them to constantly re-anchor their magnetic boots. A husk launched itself off a crossbeam, its rusted jaw unhinged, aiming straight for Sabine. She didn't have time to draw her gun. She swung the heavy battery block of the slag cutter like a hammer, smashing the ancient cyborg's head into a shower of brittle, petrified bone and sparks. It spun away into the dark abyss. Sabine clamped onto the first umbilical. She jammed the twin prongs of the slag cutter into the armored casing and pulled the trigger. Blinding white heat flared, melting through the durasteel and instantly severing the fiber optic veins inside. 1/3 of the pods above suddenly went dark. The husks connected to that trunk froze mid-leap, their amber eyes dying as they became nothing but dead weight, drifting aimlessly into the void. Barge 7, 65% saturation. "One down," Sabine roared, pushing off the bulkhead toward the second cable. The remaining husks realized what she was doing. The Gestalt mind shifted its focus from Lyra to the woman destroying their bridge. Dozens of them abandoned the cradle and leaped through the vacuum toward Sabine. Corso intercepted them. The heavy-set rigger fired his maneuvering thrusters, putting himself directly in their path with a rotary plasma torch. He carved through the dead with brutal, industrial efficiency, turning the void into a swirling cloud of superheated scrap. "Cut the cord, Captain!" Corso bellowed, taking a glancing blow from a rusted scythe arm that shattered his shoulder plating. Sabine slammed into the second umbilical. She didn't bother finding a seam. She rammed the cutter directly into the center of the cable, holding the trigger until the thermal feedback alarms screamed in her helmet. The cable snapped with a violent kinetic whip crack. Another third of the canopy went black. Down in the cradle, Lyra was bleeding. Thin streams of quicksilver leaked from her nose and eyes as the remaining fraction of the Gestalt mind fought desperately to crush her consciousness. "Sabine," Lyra's voice was a frantic digital stutter in the comms. They are too heavy. They are screaming." "Hold the line, kid," Sabine yelled, grappling to the final, thickest umbilical. This was the main trunk line. 3 husks landed on the cable beside her. One drove a rusted spike through the calf of Sabine's EVA suit. She screamed, the pain sharp and blinding, but she didn't let go of the cutter. She kicked the husk in the chest with her free boot, her magnetic sole locking onto its chassis. With a brutal twist of her leg, she hurled the monstrosity into the loom's spinning gyroscopic rings, where it was instantly pulverized. She jammed the slag cutter into the final umbilical. The battery was dying. The heat blades sputtered, barely glowing orange. "Burn, you piece of junk," Sabine snarled, bypassing the safety governors and feeding her suit's own life support battery directly into the cutter. The blade flared white-hot one last time, biting entirely through the armored trunk. The severing was absolute. A massive, silent shockwave rippled through the zero-gravity chamber as the loom forcefully ejected the corrupted data. The remaining husks instantly went limp, bouncing harmlessly off the loom's armor like discarded dolls. Down in the cradle, the neural bore needles hissed, retracting slightly. The violent amber glow faded from Lyra's eyes, replaced once again by the cool, steady silver of her matrix. "Captain," the comms officer aboard the Jarek's Toll broke the silence, his voice trembling with relief. "Green lights across the board. The loom is stabilized. Barge 7 is at 100% saturation. The fleet is breathing." Sabine hung upside down in the void, her breathing ragged, staring at the thousands of dead, floating husks. They had purged the ghosts, and they had claimed the greatest forge in the galaxy. Sabine's boots clamped magnetically to the iron deck with a heavy metallic thud. She dropped the burnt-out slag cutter, her hands shaking from the adrenaline drop and the throbbing pain in her punctured calf. Corso, favoring his shattered shoulder, limped over and clamped a pressure seal over her suit's breech. In the center of the cradle, the neural bore needles retracted fully with a hiss of depressurization. Lyra collapsed forward. Sabine ignored her injured leg and lunged, catching the girl before she hit the iron grating. Lyra's body was freezing cold, the leaden patina of her skin practically radiating the vacuum's chill. Streaks of quicksilver fluid tracked down her cheeks like tears, but her silver eyes were wide, staring through the bulkheads, through the forge, out into the endless dark. "Lyra," Sabine rasped, her breath fogging her helmet's faceplate. "Are you with me? Is the network clear?" They weren't screaming in anger, Sabine," Lyra whispered. Her voice was trembling, entirely devoid of the cold, mechanical certainty she usually carried. She sounded like a terrified child who had just woken from a nightmare. "When they tried to push into my mind, they weren't trying to overwrite me to steal my body. They were trying to warn me." Sabine frowned, glancing up at the thousands of dead husks now floating aimlessly in the zero-gravity expanse above them. "Warn you about what? The Directorate?" "The Directorate didn't abandon this place because of the bio-dreadnoughts or the cost of the conductors," Lyra said, her hands gripping Sabine's armored forearms with crushing, unnatural strength. "The Directorate abandoned it because they were terrified of what the Forge was originally built to do." Lyra pulled herself upright, her mercury eyes locking onto the massive, spinning gyroscopic rings of the Void Loom. "The Abyssal Forge isn't just a factory, Sabine. The old Empire didn't build it to conquer the core worlds. They built it to run away." Sabine felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Run away from what? From what lives on the other side of the outer rim, Lyra said, her voice dropping to a hollow echo. The first unification Scrap-Born, the ones in the pods, they were the navigators. This whole structure, it isn't a station. It's a planetary-scale engine block. It's an arc. Lyra turned her gaze away from the loom and looked out towards the massive, open trench they had used to enter the forge. The Directorate found out what was waiting in the deep dark, and they realized they couldn't fight it. So they sealed the navigators inside, shut down the loom, and built the lead horizon as a quarantine wall to keep the core worlds ignorant. Lyra, Corso interrupted, his voice tight. What exactly is out there? The architects, Lyra whispered, the ones who seeded the original Ethel Cradle tech. And they never wanted us to use it. Lyra's quicksilver tears finally stopped, her expression hardening back into the unyielding metal of the Scrap-Born. When we ignited the loom to save the barges, we didn't just turn on the oxygen. We bypassed the Directorate's quarantine protocols. We just lit a bonfire in the darkest part of the universe. On Sabine's wristcom, the bridge of the Jarek's toll broke through the static. Captain, the comms officer said, his voice stripped of the relief it had carried only moments ago. Long-range Auspex is picking up thermal blooms, massive ones, coming from the uncharted sector outside the galactic arm. They aren't Directorate signatures. They aren't bleed signatures. They aren't anything I've ever seen. How fast are they moving? Sabine asked, her grip tightening on her empty scattergun. They're not using warp drives or slip space, Captain, the officer replied, the panic bleeding back into his voice. They are folding the space around them. At their current velocity, they will intercept the forge in 72 hours. Sabine looked at the colossal machinery of the loom, then down at the blood pooling in her boot. They had traded one apocalypse for another. Corso, Sabine said, her voice flat, the cynical survivor replacing the rescuer. Tell the fleet they have air, then tell the foundry bosses to get every able body down to the loom's assembly lines. Captain, the forge is awake, Sabine said, staring up into the spinning rings of the ancient machine. We have 72 hours to figure out how to build an army. The void loom did not require assembly lines, and it did not understand the concept of sleep. For 72 hours, the Abyssal Forge consumed everything the outer rim could offer: dead comets, rogue asteroids, and the broken husks of the ancient Scrap-Born, and spun it into pure, unadulterated violence. Because time was non-existent, and aesthetics were a luxury of a dead empire, the weapons forged by the loom were brutally pragmatic. They were ugly, heavy, and completely stripped of safety limiters. Sabine walked the staging decks as the 300,000 citizens of Oros transformed from terrified refugees into an industrial militia. What the loom printed, the miners assembled. Directorate weapons relied on clean plasma and psychic targeting. The Scrap-Born arsenal relied on mass, gravity, and brute force. Weapon designation, function, and drawback. Anvil guns heavy, kinetic driver fires, molecularly compressed iron slugs at railgun velocities. Recoil shatters unaugmented human shoulders, requires heavy hydraulic bracing. Resonance cleavers close quarters. Melee industrial plasma torches rehoused into heavy iron broadswords. The blades vibrate at frequencies that shatter molecular bonds upon impact. Loom plate infantry. Armor seamless, woven iron carapaces. Lacks climate control or comfort padding, but completely impervious to standard small arms fire. It's not elegant, Corso grunted, racking the oversized charging handle of his anvil gun. The weapon sounded like a bank vault slamming shut. But if those architect things bleed, this will crack them open. The Scrap-Born didn't have time to lay down keels for new capital ships. Instead, Lyra directed the loom to cannibalize the massive, skeletal scaffolding of the forge itself, weaving it directly onto the 12 fleeing Exodus barges. The civilian longships were retrofitted into dread barges, flying iron bricks plated in 3 feet of seamless, hyperdense armor. They had no aerodynamic lines, no command spires, and no viewing ports. They were simply heavily shielded battering rams built to survive a cosmic crossfire. To defend the dread barges, the loom churned out a swarm of terrifying, mass-produced strike craft, coffin nails, ironclad interceptors. Design: a colossal sublight thruster strapped to a cockpit no larger than a coffin, tipped with a solid 10-foot kinetic penetrator spike. The catch: to save mass, there are no life support systems on board. The pilot's EVA suit is plugged directly into the ship's chemical scrubbers. Combat doctrine: they do not dogfight. They accelerate to maximum velocity and physically ram enemy vessels, driving their penetrator spikes through the hulls before detonating point-blank mining charges. As the 71st hour approached, the loom produced its masterpiece. It could not build energy shields, so it built a weapon that turned the enemy's mass against them. Mounted onto the prow of the Jarek's Toll, and the 12 dread barges were siphon cannons, massive, open-barreled arrays that looked like tuning forks the size of skyscrapers. "They aren't lasers," Lyra's voice echoed through the comms from the cradle, her tone flat and exhausted. "They reverse the loom's weaving process. When you fire the siphons, they project a localized subatomic disruption field. Whatever it hits won't burn. It will just unravel back into raw carbon and dust." Sabine stood on the bridge of the Jarek's Toll, looking at the tactical hololith. The terrified, bleeding fleet that had limped into the forge 3 days ago was gone. In its place sat an armada of blackened iron, bristling with heavy kinetics and crewed by miners who had nothing left to lose. "Captain," the comms officer whispered, the green light of the console washing over his new loom plate armor. "The 72 hours are up. The spatial folds are collapsing. The architects are here." Outside the Abyssal Forge, the absolute darkness of the Outer Rim began to tear open. The absolute dark of the Outer Rim didn't burn when the architects arrived. It shattered. There was no thermal bloom, no roar of exiting slip space, and no sensor warnings. On the tactical hololith of the Jarek's Toll, the telemetry simply stopped making sense. The physical laws of the universe were being quietly overwritten. Outside the Abyssal Forge, a perfect 2-dimensional line of blinding, sterile white light appeared in the void. It didn't tear open. Space folded backward, peeling away like the petals of a massive, silent origami lotus. "Captain," the comms officer whispered, his voice trembling as he stared at the viewport. They don't have engines." Through the tear in reality drifted the architects. They were not ships in any sense the old empire would have understood. They were monuments of impossible, frictionless geometry. There were no command decks, no exhaust vents, and no weapon batteries. They were colossal, perfect shapes, tetrahedrons, interlocking rings, and towering monoliths, carved from a material that looked like polished white porcelain fused with captured starlight. They moved without inertia, sliding through the vacuum in eerie, absolute silence. They weren't flying, they were simply instructing reality to move them forward. The collision of eras. The contrast between the two forces hanging in the abyss was a physical weight on the bridge of the Jarek's Toll. Element: the Scrap-Born, the architects. Form: brutal, heavy, asymmetrical, perfect, mathematical, seamless. Power: chemical fire, kinetic recoil, burning oil, silent manipulation of local gravity and space. Material: rusted iron, compressed carbon, slag. Pale, frictionless singularity stone. Sound, the deafening roar of industrial machinery, absolute, suffocating silence. The Scrap-Born Armada was a monument to struggle. The dread barges vented massive plumes of superheated steam into the void, their hulls vibrating with the violent, barely contained pressure of their fusion boilers. The anvil guns hummed with terrifying magnetic tension. They were loud, messy, and desperate. The architect vessels were the antithesis of struggle. They were cold, clean perfection. They looked upon the Abyssal Forge not as an enemy fortress, but as a dirty smudge on a pristine lens. A single, over-eager pilot in a coffin-nail interceptor broke formation. Driven by the adrenaline of the looming slaughter, the pilot engaged his sub-light thrusters, rocketing his crude iron ship toward the vanguard of the architect fleet, a massive, spinning pale ring. "Nail 4, break off!" Sabine roared into the comms. "We don't know their range." The interceptor closed the distance, its 10-foot kinetic spike aimed dead center at the ring. The architect vessel did not fire a laser. It didn't deploy shields. As the iron interceptor crossed an invisible threshold, a pulse of silent geometric light rippled from the white ring. In an instant, the coffin nail simply stopped existing as a ship. The local gravity around the vessel was multiplied by a factor of 10,000 in a fraction of a microsecond. The heavy iron hull, the thruster, the mining charges, and the pilot were instantly crushed into a perfectly smooth, hyperdense sphere of matter, no larger than a marble. There was no explosion, no debris. The tiny black sphere simply drifted away into the void. The bridge of the Jarek's toll went dead silent. The anvil guns and loom plates suddenly felt like children's toys compared to a civilization that weaponized math. "They don't want to fight us, Sabine." Lyra's voice drifted through the comms from the cradle, hollow and echoing with the chill of the loom. "They just want to clean us up. They see iron as an infection." Sabine stared at the flawless, approaching geometry of the architect fleet. She reached down, locking the heavy iron action of her scattergun. "Then let's show them," Sabine snarled, slamming her fist into the master targeting console. "Just how fast an infection spreads. Open fire." The command didn't echo. In the vacuum of the outer rim, the Scrap-Born Armada's response was a silent, localized apocalypse. "All batteries," Sabine roared, her voice tearing through the comms of every dread barge and interceptor. "Break their math." The Jarek's toll fired first. The massive skyscraper-sized tuning forks of its prow-mounted siphon cannon didn't unleash a beam of light. Instead, they projected a ripple of subatomic distortion, a wave of localized unmaking that tore through the void like a heat mirage. The distortion slammed into the Vanguard architect vessel, a towering pale tetrahedron that had just crushed the interceptor. For a microsecond, the architect ship's frictionless geometry tried to calculate and deflect the anomaly. It failed. The siphon cannon wasn't a physical force, it was the loom's reverse weave. Where the distortion hit the pristine, porcelain-like hull, the perfect stone didn't shatter. It violently unraveled. A massive crater of raw, chaotic carbon dust exploded outward from the tetrahedron's surface. The perfect shape was ruined, and with its geometry broken, its localized gravity shield flickered and died. "Target the fracture!" Corso bellowed from the gunnery deck, his bloodied hands gripping the firing yokes. The moment the gravity shield dropped, the Scrap-Born unloaded their brute force arsenal. 12 dread barges vented walls of superheated steam as thousands of broadside anvil guns fired simultaneously. It was a storm of primitive, undeniable mass. Tens of thousands of molecularly compressed iron slugs, accelerated to railgun velocities, crossed the void in a heartbeat. The architects attempted to adapt, Smaller, interlocking ring ships darted forward without inertia, deploying geometric fields of localized gravity to catch the barrage. Where the fields held, the iron slugs were instantly crushed into harmless microsingularities. But the architects had fundamentally miscalculated the sheer, illogical volume of the Scrap-Born's hatred. There were simply too many bullets. The iron slugs punched through the collapsing gravity fields and slammed into the fractured tetrahedron. The impact was cataclysmic. Without their mathematical perfection to sustain them, the pale singularity stone cracked like brittle glass. The towering architect vessel shuddered, then violently shattered into millions of jagged, spinning shards, completely oblivious to the vacuum's silence. With the vanguard line broken, the Scrap-Born didn't hesitate. They poured into the breach. Hundreds of coffin nails, the crude, pilot-strapped thrusters, ignited their engines, leaving blinding trails of chemical fire across the dark. They flew like a cloud of enraged wasps, actively dodging the silent, crushing flashes of architect gravity pulses that popped into existence around them. When a coffin nail was hit, it didn't explode. It simply vanished, crushed into a hyperdense marble. But for every one the architects erased, 10 more slipped through. The ironclad interceptors slammed their 10-foot kinetic penetrator spikes directly into the sides of the pristine white monoliths. The pilots didn't care about returning home. They buried their ships deep into the flawless hulls and triggered their mining charges. Muffled, dirty orange explosions bloomed across the architect fleet, cracking their perfect geometry from the inside out and venting pure, white energy into the void like bleeding starlight. On the bridge of the Jarek's Toll, Sabine watched the tactical hololith light up with the chaos of the collision. The clean, sterile erasure the architects had planned was gone. The battlefield was now a choking, violent debris field of shattered porcelain, burning iron, and venting steam. "They're falling back!" the comms officer yelled over the deafening hum of the reloading siphon cannons. "Captain, the ring ships are breaking formation." "They don't know how to fight a war of attrition," Lyra's voice chimed in from the cradle, cold and resolute. "They only know how to execute equations. We are introducing variables they cannot solve." Sabine racked the pump of her scattergun, her eyes locked on the massive, flawless sphere slowly emerging from the rear of the architect armada, a command vessel the size of a continent, glowing with an angry, shifting light. "Keep the pressure on," Sabine ordered, her voice cutting through the noise of the dying ships. "Don't give them a second to calculate. Drown them in iron." The architect command sphere, a massive undulating globe of white light, began to rotate. As it spun, the space around the Scrap-Born armada grew heavy, sluggish. It wasn't just gravity. It was as if reality itself was being thickened into cold molasses. The anvil gun's slugs slowed, their momentum sapped by the sheer density of the architect's defensive field. "They're scrubbing the local physics," Lyra's voice warned, now pulsing with the heavy rhythmic thrum of the forge itself. "They are attempting to force the forge back into a state of non-existence. They're going to erase this entire pocket of space, ships and all." "Not today," Sabine growled. She looked at the siphon cannons. They were glowing dull red, the heat sinks screaming as they struggled to process the sheer amount of feedback from the loom. "Corso, if we put the entire output of the loom into one final, focused discharge, can we punch through that sphere?" "Captain, the loom isn't designed to focus," Corso shouted, his voice cracking. "It's a broad-spectrum weaver. If we try to focus it, the whole array will melt." "Do it!" Sabine slammed her hand onto the firing console. "If we go down with a scar." The void loom deep within the forge roared. It wasn't the sound of engines. It was the sound of a star being strangled. The massive gyroscopic rings began to grind, metal screaming against metal as they locked into a single, terrifying alignment. The Jarek's toll and the 12 dread barges lurched as the loom drew every watt of power from the forge's internal fusion core. The siphon cannons converged. For the first time in the forge's existence, the divergent waves of unmaking didn't spread out. They hit an invisible focal point 3 miles in front of the armada, bending inward, twisting space until the vacuum turned a deep, bruised violet. The architects realized what was happening. The command sphere began to glow with blinding intensity, shifting its geometry, throwing up layer after layer of gravity shielding. It was a frantic, desperate calculation, an equation of survival. Sabine didn't watch the sensors. She watched the viewport. Fire! The beam didn't travel. It simply annihilated the space between the armada and the command sphere. The violet ray of anti-existence slammed into the white sphere. There was no explosion. For a heartbeat, the two forces, the architect's perfect mathematical order and the Scrap-Born's entropic industrial chaos, pressed against each other, locked in a silent cosmic stalemate. Then the forge's power hit its peak. The architect command sphere cracked. It didn't just break, it lost its hold on the fundamental constants of physics. The white light turned into a shrieking, chaotic torrent of radiation, leaking out of the sphere like blood from a mortal wound. The sphere began to lose its shape, collapsing in on itself, drawing in nearby architect ring ships, crushing its own fleet into a singularity of burning porcelain and failure. In the sudden silence, the remaining architect vessels, stripped of their command nexus and paralyzed by the collapse of their central logic gate, simply stopped. They didn't retreat. They didn't counterattack. They drifted, their white hulls turning dull, gray, and hollow. They were ships without a song. Sabine slumped against the console, her vision swimming. The Jarek's toll was dead in the water, its power couplings fused, its hull groaning under the strain of the final shot. "Is it over?" the comms officer whispered, the silence on the bridge heavy and absolute. Lyra's voice came over the comms, but it was distant, thin, and fading. "They are not gone, Sabine. They are just offline. We have broken their cycle." Sabine looked out the viewport. The Abyssal Forge, their new home, was flickering. The loom was dead, its core gutted by the final discharge. The dread barges were drifting, damaged and scarred, but they were there. "We're alive," Sabine said, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. She turned to the tactical map. The architect fleet was still there, a massive graveyard of dead, silent monoliths orbiting the forge. They had won the battle, but they were now stranded in the deepest dark of the galaxy, with a broken forge and an armada of refugees who had nowhere left to run. "We have air," Sabine said, her voice turning to the iron she had promised to build the new world from. "We have the wreckage of their fleet to scavenge, and we have 300,000 souls who are no longer hiding." She reached out, turning off the alarm sirens that had been screaming for the last hour. "Start salvage operations," Sabine ordered. "We aren't just building an empire anymore. We're building a future out of the bones of our enemies." The forge is silent. The Iron Age has begun. The Abyssal Forge arc concludes not with a fanfare, but with the hollow, grinding silence of a graveyard. The Scrap-Born have won, but they have paid the price in the destruction of the very engine that saved them. The loom is gutted, a mountain of dead metal floating in the dark. Yet, for the first time, they are not running. Sabine stands on the bridge of the Jarek's toll, looking out at the sprawling graveyard of architect monoliths. She has transitioned from a scavenger captain to a warlord of a new iron-bound civilization. The refugees are safe, but they are now citizens of a war machine. The Iron Age has begun, but it is forged in the wreckage of gods, and the gaze of the galaxy is beginning to turn toward the outer rim.